It's a long story how I ended up that way, but I ended up without a vehicle and without water, and entirely by myself in Death Valley in California. It wasn't an accident. I did a pretty good job of making some enemies along the way, and I made the right mistakes with the wrong people, and I was basically left out to hang in the worst way. They say the Death Valley area has record-soaring temperatures of 120 degrees Fahrenheit. That day, it felt much worse. Probably because I knew that I basically had been sentenced to death by the people that felt I owed them one. And it wasn't long before I began hallucinating, and the things that I saw made all those kid cartoons of characters lost in the desert much less funny, because I saw everything that those characters saw. Tropical oasis brimming with water. I had always thought that people mistook the heat waves for the shimmering of water. The mirages got 100 times more vivid. I tried to keep my senses and resist the urge to go towards any of these oases, and believe me, the urge to do so was very powerful. I had never seen a hallucination seem so concrete and so inviting. A few times, I thought I could even hear the splashing of water, and I did give in a couple of times. But as you'd expect, when I went towards the mirages, they'd either move further away or disappeared entirely. Soon, I couldn't even tell where I was or which direction I was going, and I thought that my death would be imminent. At one point, all the mirages had ceased, or so I thought. I looked around and saw not water, but a figure approaching me. In the dancing, dizzying heat, it was hard to tell that it was a person, because it looked to be unusually tall. I stand at least 5'10", and this thing seemed like it would tower over me if it stood right in front of me. It had an extremely muscular build. I say it because it had many features that were not even remotely human. It had a face that reminded me of the sleek snout of Anubis of the Egyptian god of death. Basically, I thought I was seeing a dog walking on its hind legs, too comfortably. A dog that appeared that it had spent the last 30 years in the gym, working on its muscles and tone. I began to think to myself that at least I wouldn't have to die of exposure. Having my throat ripped out by some unknown monster wouldn't be pleasant, but at least it would be quick. Instead of converging on me, it chose to walk next right to me. I was thinking it was going to be like a buzzard. It was going to wait until I fell over dead before it would tear into me. Then another one just like it came out of the heat waves, and it began walking next to me on my left. I began having visions of myself losing consciousness and then collapsing, and then both of them chewing on my innards before I could even hit the sand. My survival instincts rebelled against the thought, and I felt the slightest uptake of energy, so I forced myself to keep walking. A third dog creature, even taller than the other two, appeared right in front of me from out of the heat waves, and it was at that point that I thought that I was truly delirious, because the creatures appeared to be carrying a wooden staff. What was it going to do? It grunted at me and turned around and began walking. After it walked a few steps, it looked over its shoulder. I was apparently supposed to follow it. I thought that I was as good as dead, so I may as well follow whatever this hallucination would take me. If I began to lag behind, the other two creatures on either side of me would draw close. I was led over a very tall dune, which felt like climbing Mount Everest in the condition that I was in. When I got over the dune, everything made sense. There in the wilderness with me was a U.S. military helicopter with a crew of soldiers performing a drill. They were airlifting a crate that they had been sent out to find, and they were being timed on how quickly they could find it with just coordinates. With the shock of hope I noticed that my 3 tour guides were now gone, and that's when I collapsed. I look back on the incident and I question if it even really ever happened. Well, it did. I was wandering the desert, and I did find that helicopter. But about the 3 dog-like creatures, I've been listening to some of your stories as I put mine together, and I don't think I've ever heard anyone publish anything saying that dogmen were ever friendly. Most of your stories seem to portray them as feral, and sometimes they leave humans alone. Sometimes they don't. Maybe I really just did see the whole thing in a fit of heat exhaustion and pure and utter hallucination. This story comes from my brother, who's normally too busy spending his money on another hit of heroin instead of putting money towards something more intelligent like a phone. We touched bases just long enough for him to tell me about some crazy dramatic adventure that he has gotten himself into for his quest for another fix. Some are more exciting than others, assuming there's any truth. Some of them might even be suitable. He is not by himself a very creative individual, so I have a hard time thinking he could have made a story like this one up. So, here it goes. My brother is one of those customers that's bad for business. Even when he has money, his dealers have to chase him down. But more often than not, he doesn't have the money that he owes. And so he's kind of left. Some dealers just decide they're not going to sell to him anymore. Others decide that they will get the money that he owes them one way or another. And apparently, my brother made the mistake of accumulating a pretty steep tab with not just any ordinary dealer, but an entire syndicate that was responsible for the higher-end street drugs. The stuff that doesn't have any fillers. They didn't like it that my brother suddenly didn't have the money for the good stuff, so they went out of their way to drag him to one of their central hubs, located in a condemned underground cemetery. I know it sounds extremely far-fetched, but Google it. There are a few of these in the world. They're basically mausoleums, laid out underground like subway tunnels. Some of them have become structurally unstable, so they're no longer open to public, and that allows people like dealers and suppliers to move in. So, they locked my brother in a solid marble crypt that was big enough to have a couple of hallways. At first, you thought they did it to play on his anxiety. They had the place lit up with a few dim candles. Well, it got worse. Turns out, there was actually something locked in there with him. He could hear it stalking around the hallways, snarling. He was expecting to see a large dog or a hellhound, or a pit bull or something. But when it came around the corner, it was on 2 legs. The face was human, but also that of a wolf, and looked to be completely wrong. The teeth were more ogreish, very sharp, poking out its mouth, and all the rest of it was very canine, with the eyes and the ears, even the hocks of its feet, and the long, bushy, mangy tail. The worst part of the whole thing were the eyes. The first thing he noticed is that they were glowing, and had a very similar light to those that were the candles that were scattered. The second thing he noticed was that it looked like that of a hungry predator. The only reason why my brother survived the encounter, according to him, is that he slid in one of the cracks that would accommodate his scrawny frame, but was too tight for the bulk of this wolf creature. He wondered why the crack was so narrow, since such things are usually built to generously take care of an entire coffin. And then he realized that he was in a fracture in both the structure and the earth, due to the instability of the underground mausoleum. It was at that point that my brother had a mental breakdown and nearly beat himself bloody against the narrow confines of the fissure that he was in. His captors took that as a clue to withdraw the predator and let my brother out. They gave him 48 hours to run up the money that he owed. Needless to say, he found a way to pay it pretty quick. It does sound kind of far-fetched, but he made it pretty clear that these cartel had complete and total control over this creature or being, which to me is the main focal point of this story. To think that these people have control over supernatural beings, that's terrifying. I was trying to help my grandpa locate something that he had dropped when we went on a little fishing excursion to a pond in the middle of the woods that he owns. Well, come to find out that just because he owns the woods, it doesn't mean that he knows his way around. But I can't blame him. He's getting older, and his memory is slipping. He had managed to drop his eyeglasses and make it all the way back to the house without realizing that he wasn't wearing them. That's the entire man's personality in a nutshell. We retraced his steps. All the while I was thinking that his glasses were at the bottom of the pond. Of course, we checked, and there was nothing. In a moment of desperation, we split up and began combing the general area where they could have fallen. I found them, and I heard a crunching of trees and branches off to my side. I thought it was my grandfather, and I would finally be able to tell him, "Hey, we found him. Let's go home." I looked over to him to find out that he wasn't there, but instead confronted with a towering bipedal beast that eyed me with two glowing amber eyes. The brow and the eyes were nearly human, at least in bone structure and shape. The nose and muzzle definitely weren't. This thing was disgusting, covered in black and gray fur. I panicked inside when I saw that this thing was clutching my grandfather's hat. My first natural reaction was this thing had attacked my grandfather, and I was next. But instead, it bolted and ran away. 10 seconds later, I caught my breath and saw my grandfather looking around, telling him I was very relieved to see him. But he just looked at me puzzled and confused, having no idea what I was talking about. Since I still had his glasses, he might not have even noticed the strange wolf creature. I gave him back his glasses, and then he told me that he thinks he also lost his hat out there somewhere. I never told him about what I saw. One of my favorite pastimes is astrology. I have some great equipment for looking up at the skies and stars at night, but what you're really in need of sometimes is just overall darkness. You see, artificial light from street lamps and cars and whatnot can really impair your night vision, and to be able to see the amazing celestial bodies. So, when there was a chance of a rare constellation coming into view, I packed up my telescope and other equipment and headed off into the woods, where I wouldn't be bothered by headlamps, cars, streetlights. Ultimately, zero distractions. I was all set up and ready right around midnight, with the supposed best time to catch the sighting right around 12:30. I even had coffee to keep me awake, but I was more than excited with the adrenaline and being all cozy, wrapped up and nice and warm. Thankfully, it was early October time, so although cool, it wasn't too freezing just yet. And just after midnight, I heard some shuffling in the leaves close by. This wasn't exactly a great surprise, and there were very likely all sorts of nocturnal creatures wondering what on earth this intruder was doing in their home. I was the trespasser to them, so long as whatever nosy animal didn't come and disturb me whilst I was trying to record a very rare sighting. I didn't really care. I knew nightlife was active, but I didn't want to be bothered. To be honest, I was so mesmerized by staring up at the stars, due to the amazing clarity without any light pollution. It took me a few minutes to realize the curious animal had indeed decided to come a little closer, and it was making a noise that I wasn't too happy. Rather than a cute chittering from a squirrel or maybe some sort of possum or raccoon, I can now clearly hear a heavy, raspy breathing. It also seemed to be far too close to me for comfort, tearing my eyes away from the telescope for just a few seconds. I stood up, shone my light around, and I had almost done a full sweep when I caught sight of the heavy breather. I very nearly dropped my flashlight in shock, for there stood something which not only should not have been in the woods, but all rights should not even exist. I'm a man of science, and I gaze up at the night sky from an astronomy point of view, not astrology. I do not believe in things that go bump in the night, and yet, standing before me, what I can only describe as a man-sized and shaped dog. It was likely around 6 feet, had a little body, but all the lean and toned muscles of an athlete, except covered in black fur. It was clearly bipedal, yet the lower limbs were similar to its canine hind leg counterparts, and they were also bowed in the knee. The arms were more like a human, and the head reminded me somewhat of a cross between a Doberman Pinscher and a hyena, except far uglier. Despite the slender-looking torso, the head was also overly large. It had very small eyes, and a very disturbing look on its face, like it was intent on getting me. I'm not young, and it would have been pointless to try and put up any resistance if it were to attack me. From the look of this thing, and judging by its strength and ultimate stealth abilities, I would have been a goner if it really wanted to. And yet it didn't appear aggressive. More like, why are you here? However, its presence was more than enough for me to hastily pack up and hurry back home. I didn't get to see the rare constellation, but I wasn't too sure how long I was welcome. I've never told a living soul about this, because I don't think anybody would ever believe me. After all, I even feel silly typing it out. It would probably also likely destroy any reputation as a man of science that I have. After this encounter, it's opened my mind up to other possibilities of existence too. Hopefully, for me, that's a good thing. A few weeks ago, I was driving back from a friend's house when I saw something scurry across the road in front of me. I slammed on my brakes due to not wanting to hit it, and it was only late afternoon, but it had been raining, so my lights were on. The roads were wet too, so I was trying to be extra mindful. I've seen all sorts of things make a mad dash, like deer and bucks, nearly totaling my car in the process. I guess the woods were here long before the road, and the animals that live in these parts don't exactly know the Green Cross code. But now, stopped in the road, lights and wipers on full, I saw the strangest looking animal that has ever run out from the trees. I would have said it was as tall as a man, with a body like a man too, but like a Stone Age man, covered in thick woolly hair, and slightly hunched over. It stood on 2 long legs, but looked like its spine might be curved, and had really long, outstretched arms that kind of dangled. Apart from the fact that it obviously appeared naked, just skin and very thick, thin, woolly hair, from the neck down, maybe it could have been some sort of person. Except the head was not human at all. It looked like that of a dog, kind of like a German Shepherd dog, except its face was more narrow, if that makes sense. Like a German Shepherd, the face is more broad and wide, with wide ears, but this snout was much smaller, much longer, and much more narrow, and its upper eye bone muscles were much more pronounced, if that makes sense. The head was all furry too, and the ears were also much taller and much more pointed. The eyes were also much more set back in its skull than a German Shepherd. I wasn't really sure what to do, and on impulse, I put my hand on the horn, just like I would have had it been a deer or another animal. It made a weird grunting, distorted sound, and disappeared running off through the trees on the opposite side of the road. The woods over there were thicker, and go on for miles and miles, and are supposedly meant to be the rumors that it is haunted. Well, I'm pretty sure there ain't no ghost in there. But there's definitely this animal, that's for sure. Whenever I get bad news of any kind, I take off. Always have done, and probably always will. It's just my way of coping. Sometimes I might just head out of the house and walk until my head clears. Other times I have jumped in the car and ended up in another state even, which I guess isn't saying much, since I'm only an hour away from my state's border. I'd already had a couple of beers, so the car option was out of the question, when I got a phone call alerting me to the fact that my aunt, whom I was very close with, had died. I just grabbed my keys and walked out of the house. I didn't know where I was headed, just that I had to walk and walk until the news sank in. It was already late afternoon, as I'd been enjoying the game with a couple of beers, so by the time I had reached the woods at the far end of town, it was beginning to get dark. I hadn't been around there in years, but I remembered as a kid and a teenager, there used to be rumors about a dog walker finding mutilated bunnies and hearing high-pitched sounds coming from the depths of the woods. A story and tale I called total BS on, and sounded to me like something our parents would have made up to keep us from getting out of trouble. The last thing on my mind right then was whether there might be bunny bodies littered about, or some wild, ravenous beast who gets his rocks off by screaming at passerbyers. To be honest, I barely even registered how far I was into the woods when it suddenly dawned on me that I could only just see where I was going. That seemed to be the point at which I knew that I had walked far enough away from home, and now needed to turn back for the long return trek. Usually when I clear my head, I end up somewhere that I still recognize. It's like my body goes onto autopilot and just walks, but at the same time my mind keeps me on a track that I know. Not this time. This time, I ended up in the deep woods, and I hadn't been there for about 20 years. Every path still looked the same. Still, this was not the time to panic. I literally did a 180 and hoped that it was the direction that I had entered the woods by. And of course, right at that moment, I stepped on something that I can only describe as gooey. It felt sticky and wet. When I shone my light from my cell phone down on the ground, I could see that it was dark and thick, and there were little bits of what looked to be bone and fur. It was a dead animal, or what was left. I felt sick to my stomach, and tried wiping the gore off my shoe. A little voice popped into my head right then. If the stories about the dead rabbits and animals were true, I began panicking, complete and total panic. I started to run, which if you have ever seen a horror movie, or indeed been in the woods in the dark, you will know this is never a good idea, because even if the monster doesn't get you, the low branches and brambles sticking out of the ground will, or you'll run straight into something solid. If you are lucky, that will be a sturdy tree, and you can pick yourself up. But in my case, this solid mass was hot, furry, and audibly making a groaning noise. As I lay there on the floor, I quickly pulled out my cell phone to see exactly what was there. And this thing was huge, taller and broader than me, covered in hair, a strong body and arms and legs like a man, except for the hair of course. And then the head was something else altogether, because the head reminded me very much of a wolf. Pointy ears and very intelligent, fierce yellow eyes. It had its mouth open, with a terrible grin on its face, like it couldn't have been more excited to get to me, because now it had an expression like it wanted to tear me limb from limb, and a sort of malice. That's when I picked myself up, and surprisingly, it let me continue running out of the woods, and never try to get back to me, or run after me. I guess the only reason people see dead animals in there is because this thing doesn't eat people, maybe. Scary as it was to actually see this thing, I feel better knowing that it let me go and didn't kill me. But I can't help wonder why. Why didn't it kill me? even though I was right there in its grasp, and it seemed to be enjoying the fact that I was there in front of it, and that I saw it. I'll never know. Before I dive in, let me give you some quick information. I live in Oregon State, and I have cousins that I'm very close with. Well, they live on a very large amount of acreage in Montana. We like to keep up to date with each other with bi-weekly phone calls. And because of COVID and everything that's been happening, I haven't had the chance to call them in the past month, at least since before Thanksgiving. So, we were having our usual hourly conversation, chatting up, and my cousin starts talking to me about having and knowing anything about North American wild hyenas. When I was asking him more what he meant by wild hyenas, he was saying that on his acreage, he noticed about a month ago, shortly after Halloween. Actually, I think it was right around Election Day, he noticed a pack of these large, what he calls wild dogs, except they were larger than any wild dog he's ever seen. We're talking larger than a male buck, a 5-pointer, but he said these weren't just any wild dog. They looked wrong, other than their sheer, large, abnormal size. They resembled that of a hyena, at least in the face, and even had arched, weird, funky backs, and even looked disjointed, if that makes any sense. The more he began describing these to me, the more I began to think to myself, Dogman. I've been a huge fan of that kind of show, and I've been binge listening to your Dogman encounters for quite some time. So, this just sent off red flags for me, and told me right away exactly what I'm pretty confident that he is seeing. Now, my cousin doesn't really believe in any of that stuff, so I didn't exactly mention to him that I believe personally he has a pack of dogmen running around on his acreage, but I thought it would be interesting to send to you and tell me, or hopefully confirm, that my thinking is correct. He indeed has a pack of dogmen running around. One of the scariest events I can physically remember is back years ago when I spent around 8 to 9 months in Oklahoma. At the time, I was in a very abusive, toxic relationship with a girl whose name I won't mention. But at that time, I was also going through a phase where I really loved to do off-road exploring, where I would go off-trail for miles and miles, as far as I could, just to explore new heights, see new things, and be surrounded by true, unfiltered nature. Well, it was during one of these treks where at first I felt like I was being watched. At the time, I was very naive and ignorant to the wildlife around me, specifically that of Oklahoma's. To this day, I'm still not exactly sure if there are wolves in this state. If I remember correctly, I think I had heard there used to be red wolves, but I don't think they're there anymore. But what I saw that day looked nothing like that of a red wolf. I was going down a large hill on this unbeaten path, and off to my far left, just beyond some timber, I saw something that looked like a person, except it was a wolf head peering out of the trees, staring right at me, from maybe 50 to 60 yards away, enough that I could clearly make eye contact with whatever this was. My first instinct was that it was a large dog, a wolf, actually, since that's what it resembled, although its eyes were much more yellow and striking than just that of a regular dog. And as soon as I looked up and made eye contact with this large animal, my stomach knotted up. It's like my body knew that whatever this wasn't a natural occurring animal. Because then, not even a second later, without breaking eye contact, it stood up on 2 legs. Something that I don't think dogs could normally do, at least the way this did. When it stood up, it was exactly like a person, a very bulky bodybuilder type person. The body, from what I could see from my distance, looked like you took Arnold Schwarzenegger in his heyday, covered him with fur like a bear, maybe a little thinner, and made it a brownish gray, and then stuck the head of a wolf right on top, a gray wolf to be exact, with more fierce, striking yellow eyes. Once this animal stood up, you could clearly see that this thing was massive. I don't exactly know what it was, but I just stopped, and I was kind of half frozen in fear, half in awe at whatever creature I was observing. And it seemed to be curious with me too. And that's the impression I got, because it too never broke its gaze. I figured it was safe to slowly start backtracking and make my way back the distance I came, so I very slowly backpedaled my way up this small hill until it was completely out of sight, or at least until I and it couldn't see each other anymore. That's when I turned and ran. I mean, not full-on sprint, but I did a nice little jog. I didn't think this thing was predatory per se, or that it would follow me, or anything like that. But I wasn't going to take any chances, not knowing exactly what animal I could be dealing with. Looking back on it, at the time, I didn't know anything about cryptids, or dogmen, or really much about Bigfoot. But now that I'm more aware of such things like dogmen, I'm pretty certain that's exactly what it is that I saw. Currently, I'm residing up here in Northern California, just a mile or so north of Sacramento. Well, I've heard some crazy stories recently about not only Bigfoot, but dogmen as well. See, I have a few friends of mine that are native, and I can't exactly remember their tribe, but I do remember what they referred to as Bigfoot. They called them mountain devils because apparently, these same beings would raid these villages at night, stealing women and children, taking them back to wherever they were, and cannibalizing and eating them. Terrifying, right? Well, they would have the same issues with these dogmen, that I can't exactly remember what they called them. They had a native word for them, which I'm not going to try and type it out, because I would probably butcher it. Apparently, these dogmen would fight these mountain devils, or Bigfoot, for the prey of the villages, basically the women and children. They would literally fight to the death over these prey, and also attack the villages too. There was even a time where certain sects of the tribe up here would have warring factions against these Bigfoot and dogmen all at the same time. It's pretty crazy to learn that dogmen and Bigfoot both have a helping hand in the violent history that took place here. Unfortunately, much of it was them provoking the natives, and the natives just trying to survive and defend themselves properly. According to my close sources, which again is several of my close native friends, this has been going on for hundreds of years, and recently has been kept very quiet. Recently being in the past 100 years. I don't know if there's some conspiracy to keep Bigfoot and dogmen on the down low, but it seems to be in working order. I don't know if there's still a war going on between dogmen, Bigfoot, and the natives around here, but I do tell you that they are still very hostile. At least the dogmen are. I do hear stories about certain sects of Bigfoot not being hostile and more curious, even presenting some sects of tribes with gifts and bearings and peace treaties, I guess you can call them. But the dogmen remain extremely aggressive, territorial, and very violent if approached. In fact, there's even certain areas you just don't want to go because you just want to avoid these creatures altogether. They will kill you, and they will not think twice about it. How that correlates to other dogman stories that you hear, ones where there's plenty of opportunity to seize the kill, but they never do, I'm not exactly sure. I can only relate to you what I know and what I've heard. And what I've heard is apparently these dogmen are extremely violent and dangerous. I'll tell you what, I sure as hell wouldn't want to be caught between the line of them and a Bigfoot. I'm not going to reveal one of my friend's identities because he has a story to tell me, but apparently, one of these dogmen, very recently actually, in the past 3 or 4 months, tried breaking into a small trailer, jiggling the door handle, trying to get into the windows by scratching, and even howling and growling, making all sorts of bizarre animalistic noises to try and lure him outside, and even frighten him. No, he is not involved in witchcraft, or any seances, or anything to summon these creatures to him. He is simply just minding his own business, trying to live, and very much not even enriched in his own native culture, although he is aware of many of the tales and stories that have been passed down. He thinks it's because he's at the edge of his property, or the edge of the native property, apparently the area in which these things are closest to. I guess they still travel back and forth between areas, and even up to his trailer. This has happened before, but more so just very recently, and I guess other family and natives in the area have also been having and complaining about similar problems. Of course, police are no help, so they really just keep it to themselves, and anybody who knows anything about it and can help them. Unfortunately, knowing what I do, I can't really help, nor would I want to. Not because I don't care about my friend, but because what am I supposed to do against a 400-pound, 9-foot-tall beast? You get my picture. I'm not trying to ramble on and on. I just thought you might like to know that these things are very much so real, and might find this information useful, as well as interesting. Hope this does you well. Back when I was a little girl, I can remember this very vividly. I used to go horseback riding with my father, nearly all the time, maybe every few days. My father, while not necessarily a rancher, owned large land all behind us and around us. Pasture, with more trees and more pasture, rolling hills and mountains in the distance. I was fortunate enough to grow up in a very beautiful part of the state of Colorado, a place that still holds my heart to this day. Even though I no longer live in this state, it will always be held dear to me, and my childhood was something special. But even with good childhoods can sometimes come traumatic memories. This isn't necessarily a traumatic memory, but it is a bad memory, and I can just remember how scared my dad was. To preface, my dad was a pretty hard man. He had been through, seen a lot. He was kind of like a rugged mountain man. Even rattlesnakes didn't even make him flinch. He knew how to deal with a lot of dangerous situations, and, like him, many people who were used to living off the land were kind of just like that. Hard, sturdy people. Well, his whole family was like that, so it's no wonder he's like that. And I feel like I got a lot of my emotional and mental resilience from him. Thanks, Dad. And out of all the times in my life, I think there's only maybe 2 or 3 times that I ever saw him scared. This was one of them. We were horseback riding on a trail that we had horseback rode many times before. My father would usually ride alongside me, but this particular moment on the road, he was about 2, maybe 3 feet ahead of me, when he stopped his horse abruptly, and my horse responded by stopping abruptly as well. He called out to me to be quiet, and turned his head off to the left. At the time, I didn't hear exactly what he was hearing, but he put his finger up to his mouth and motioned to shh. When I listened intently, and I could hear movement coming off from the bramble to the left. To give you a little bit better picture, to the left of us was a very thick bramble patch. If you were to get down off your horse, crawl down off the road by about 3 or 4 feet, there was blackberries everywhere. Oh, and this was in August, the perfect time for picking them, which I loved to do when I was a little girl, by the way. But at the time, I was on my horse and didn't understand what he was listening for. But as soon as I heard the movement, I too could depict that it was coming from a large animal. Within seconds, I realized we've come across a bear, potentially a mama bear and her cubs, and figured we need to go now. But that's when the movement seemed to escalate from the distance that we both thought it was at to right up in the bramble, when it lifted its huge head out of the bramble and stared at my dad and I. It was not at all what we expected. It was not a bear, nor did it look anything like a bear. It was almost larger than a bear. Unlike bears, who stand up on 2 legs when they're curious, or maybe waddle for a short distance, this was built like a bodybuilder, just like a man. And from the upper chest all the way to the head, which as it stood up to the bramble patch was completely visible, it had the largest dog head I've ever seen in my life, except it was much uglier. Imagine taking the face of a hyena, or maybe a German shepherd, and distorting the face. It's hard to accurately paint the picture, but it's my best idea of a description. I just remember large teeth protruding out of both its lower and upper jaws. Think like a dinosaur almost. Although this thing didn't look anything like a dinosaur, it had that same style of teeth. Overly large, razor-sharp teeth poking out of its mouth. Even its canines were protruding from its front face, and it had a very long and narrow snout, but the entire head was kind of like that of a lion. Not that it actually looked like a lion, but that it had a large kind of hairy mane on the neck and the face. But the head was very much canine. The ears were very tall and pointed. Before I sent you this email, I tried to take some own personal time, hop on Google, and see if I can find any pictures of werewolf-like creatures to give you a good depiction of something to go by. And the closest thing I could find was a mix of the movie The Howling, the werewolves in that movie, and the other werewolves from the movie Dog Soldiers. How both those creatures have this wild animal bestial look to them. How they have this thick, kind of hairy, wiry, hairy mane to them. If you need help envisioning what I'm talking about, just simply Google either of those movies, and you'll immediately know what I'm talking about. Now, I'm not saying this creature, or whatever it was, looked and resembled those two creatures exactly, but the resemblance is close enough that I can confidently use that as an accurate depiction of what it is that I saw. Upon emerging, this thing acted more surprised than we were to see it. It glanced over at me quickly, and then glanced over at my father, never once moving its head, only darting its darkened eyes over at me and then at my father, as if kind of a, "What are you guys doing here?" kind of expression on its face. It didn't appear hostile, and it didn't appear aggressive in any way, or like it was going to kill us, like I would have thought when I was young. But my father, God bless his heart, who was very protective of me, I saw the color drain from his face, and not because he was terrified, but maybe because he instinctively knew the killing power of whatever this animal was, as if he had possibly seen it before. That's the gist I got out of it. He immediately reacted, but before he could really do anything, both horses, at the sight of this thing, went nearly crazy and knocked me off the horse. I fell to the ground and actually lost consciousness for a bit. My father was also nearly knocked off the horse, but it all happened so fast. All I can remember is this sighting that lasted for a few seconds, and then the horse bucked me off, and I probably flew a few feet in the air, and then onto the ground, where I landed on my head and neck, and thank you God, I landed just right, as if to not break my neck, because I easily could have died with how I landed. The next thing I know, I'm waking up to my father holding me, crying, trying to get me to come back. He thought I was gone, but I awoke with him, holding me in his arms, telling me everything's going to be okay. Both horses were right by him. He had calmed them down. When I asked him what had happened, he just told me everything's going to be alright. Let's head home. So very calmly, we sat there for a few more moments, when I felt I was able to get up, regain somewhat strength, as if to not be too dizzy. I climbed on the horse with him, and we rode off back home, about 4 or so miles. On the ride back, it was pretty quiet. I didn't say anything or ask him anything. I think I was so busy trying to come to, trying to fight off the dizzy spells and the throbbing headache of having landed on my neck and head. When we got back, and as the day progressed, my father, something just didn't seem right. He seemed very deeply troubled, didn't speak a lot, which is unlike him, and while he's not a social butterfly, he's also not a mute. When I was finally feeling better enough to ask him about what we saw, what exactly we had encountered on that ride, he just sat me down and told me that I need to be extremely careful where I play and what it is that I'm doing outside. I told him I didn't understand, and he would never go into detail, but as I stated previously in the last paragraph, I feel that he knew what was up, that he knew something about whatever it is that we saw. His reaction just told me that this wasn't a genuine fresh reaction, that he had apparently dealt with this before. I know my father's done a lot of running around in the woods before, a lot of animal wrangling, and I know his family has too. So it wouldn't surprise me, and I wouldn't put it past him to deal with a predator like this, assuming that's what it was. At least that's the way my father acted. He acted the same way as one time when I was younger, around 5 years old, that we did run into a mom and her cubs. It was this instinctual, he needed to protect me and that we were in danger. It was that same fleeting feeling coming over him again. There was no mistaking it. And then the fact that my dad was acting so weird about it, wouldn't talk about it, wouldn't mention it, just kept writing it off and saying that I needed to be careful. I just couldn't help shake the fact that he knew something that I didn't. Well, he ended up dying when I was 17 years old, and as hard as that was, I've been able to take what he's taught me and learn a lot from it. I just wish he would have told me what it is that he saw that day before he finally passed, because now I'll never know. But I will never forget the memory of that encounter that day, and whatever creature the Colorado wilderness holds. Luckily, I haven't seen such an animal since then, and I hope that I don't, because I've ran into wolves, I've ran into bears, and other animals. While I'm not a mountaineer like my father, I still enjoy being out in the wilderness and enjoying what nature has to offer. But I haven't encountered that creature yet, nor will I ever truly know what it was. But part of me wonders if this animal or creature is native to this area of wilderness, or if this is something that roams around the country in certain spots. While my story isn't long, I firmly stand by what I experienced that day, back in May of 1999. During this time, I was looking around, scouting areas for the best turkey hunting. There's a very specific area in the mountain range around me that I know lots of wild turkeys like to congregate and come together. But to get there, you have to go through a lot of thick fir and timber. There is an old logging road that will take you a few miles up, and then from there, it's about another 3 miles on foot, all through thick, dense forest. Not a problem, since I'm pretty much raised and born in the woods. But on this day, in May of 1999, on my way to that spot in question, I was attacked by some upright, bipedal canine that I'm still not exactly sure what it was. Luckily for me, I came out unharmed, as I did not allow it to get close enough to do any real damage. I put enough rounds in that thing that it should have died, but I think I only pissed it off, because it retreated and sounded like more were following after me. So part of me thinks that it was an ambush or some sort of trap, like they knew I was there and they were getting ready, calculating the perfect time to ambush me and take me down. I can't prove that theory, but from the noises that I heard after this thing took off, like there was more of them around me, surrounding me, coming towards me, that was more than enough proof in my mind that I needed to get out of there and leave. Besides the fact that I was just attacked by some unknown bipedal canine that I'm not sure where it came from or what it was, nor have I ever seen it in my life. Before I jump into the actual description of the account itself, I'm gonna lay this flat out. I don't normally listen to horror stories or watch horror movies. I don't believe in vampires, werewolves, monsters, zombies, ghosts. None of that. I like to think that real life doesn't contain any of those fictional things. But since this happened to me, I feel like my mind and the possibilities have been opened a little more. After I got out of my truck, I was parked on this old logging road. And remember, I'm out here in the middle of nowhere. There's not a soul around for at least 10 miles. I can remember some of these details very well, because the entire account stands so strong in my brain. I want to say, I probably wasn't even 200 yards up the trail from my truck when the entire woods around me went deathly silent. Now, that only means one thing. There's a large predator in the area, and all the wildlife knows it. That means no birds, no squirrels chirping and chittering. That's what I expected, which is exactly why I kept a firearm on me. My thoughts at the time were a mountain lion, and mountain lions can be known to attack people given the right circumstances, of them being hungry, and you being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And while it wasn't exactly a mountain lion, it was something much, much worse. I still refused to lay down and die that day. I was going to hold my ground no matter what. I didn't care if it was a giant. I would have taken it down. So where I was on the trail was a very gradual incline. It probably started off at the base of the road, right where my truck is. You walk across the logging road, and it's a very, very gradual incline. Probably 500, 600 yards before reaching the top of a ridge. Then it's a very gradual decline, and then flattens out after a while. You take this for about another couple miles, and it drops down again into almost a little valley, if you want to call it that. A very large clearing with a small little creek that if you follow it, and I have before, it feeds into a larger river that runs through the entire area. So when the woods around me went deathly silent, and it was instantly noticeable, I was still able to turn around from my position and clearly see my truck, and also turn around from there and clearly see the top of the ridge that I was walking to. Once the woods became quiet, I became aware. Acute senses kept me alert of everything going on. I continued my pace, keeping my hand on my gun, when I made it probably about another 100 yards, maybe more, when I started to hear movement off to my right. At first, it sounded like something moving around, like a small animal. Nothing to be concerned about immediately, but it went from rustling to a thrashing sound, as if something big was throwing itself all around in the brush. And keep in mind this was May, so everything was freshly lush and grown back from wintertime. I kept my focus on the right of me, but still continuing my pace, not exactly sure what was going on, thinking perhaps a mountain lion was about to pounce on me, but I wasn't exactly sure. Then, I make it about another 60 yards, and up the trail from me, probably about another 50 to 100 yards, only about another 100 yards up from the top of the ridge, if that's not confusing, jumps this bipedal canine out on the trail. The trail, by the way, is a game trail. It's been used, but it's pretty overgrown and worn out, leaving just enough room for me to travel through without thick, crazy brush blocking my way. I want to say there was maybe 2 feet of total clearance, where on both sides of me were thick timber and brush. And right as this thing jumps out, I'm already keeping my attention to the noises on my right and also keeping ahead of me, trying to be extremely alert and in tune to everything surrounding me. When this thing jumps out in front of me, it looks right at me, and that's what made me stop dead in my tracks. At this point, my hand was already on my gun, and I knew instinctively, just from being out in the woods enough, that this was no natural creature, and this meant danger. Nothing can replicate the look that it gave me. It was in no way a look of imminent surprise. It was a look like you shouldn't be here, and now I'm gonna make you pay. This thing probably stopped and stared at me for 1 minute. I don't even know if it was able to size me up in that time, but it immediately began turning into a runner's stance, like a runner does, and starts jogging toward me on 2 legs, arms outreached and mouth open, as if it's going to grab me. I immediately don't even hesitate, pull out my gun, and start firing several rounds into this thing. It probably makes it within, I want to say 20 to 30 yards from me, after I've already fired several rounds, and jumps off into the left side of me, running 90 degrees from me. Now this thing is running like a bulldozer through the woods, screaming the loudest horrific noise I've ever heard, and is going perpendicular away from me in the woods. Meanwhile, there's also noise still on my right that's getting louder and louder, and after several more seconds goes by, and the screaming of that thing that I shot gets quieter and quieter, the noises around me begin to come alive. That's when I began to hear thick thrashing from not only my right, but to my 5 o'clock, my 2 o'clock, and my 7 o'clock, all sounding like they're getting closer and closer to me. Now I truly felt that feeling of imminent danger, and that I needed to get out of there now if I wanted to live. So, very calmly, I turned around, but also keeping my eyes around me 360 degrees. I quickly made my way back down the trail, the several hundred yards I'd already walked, making sure to keep pace and keep track of everything around me. The noise and the thrashing continued and followed me all the way down to the end of the game trail, where it connects to the old logging road. As I was roughly within 50 yards of the logging road, and only another 20 from the truck, I began to hear that screaming sound coming back, heading right towards me from the diagonal angle in the woods. What I assumed to be the same canine bipedal creature that I had shot just moments previously. It sounded like it was pissed, and it was coming down the ridge on a diagonal angle, coming towards me and the truck. I knew at this point I had to double time it, or there wasn't going to be any of me left. I had no idea what I was dealing with. This is some advanced, unknown large predator. I made it back into my truck, flew in, pulled the car in gear, and drove out of there quicker than I could have. I probably drove so fast, I think I nearly bent my axle driving over some of the rocks of the old, crappy logging road. I mean, after all, there were a lot of rocks that you had to be careful. Driving in, I was probably doing about 10-20 miles an hour. These were really large rocks, but driving out of there, I want to say I was probably doing close to 40, maybe more. Trying to preserve my life was far more important. There were points where I could hear the rocks grinding against my front axle, and I was just praying to God that it did not do any damage to my truck. Luckily, I made it down the logging road and back to one of the more main roads that it took me back. I can't tell you if the noises ceased once I got in my truck, flipped a U-ey, and got out of there, because I didn't have my windows rolled down, and I was not looking back. I did not want to risk that thing bursting out of the woods, coming to pull me out of my truck and take me away. But if that's what it was doing, it had missed me by a very short amount. As far as the other noises that were going crazy in the woods near me, I'm not sure. But what disturbs me is as soon as I shot at this thing several rounds, and it flew off into the woods and began running and screaming away, the noise around me erupted, as if these things were now signaled to come and ambush me and get closer. Even though I described to you the sounds as thrashing around and rustling, they became louder and louder, not only in volume, but in distance. I truly believe that this thing did not act alone, and as soon as this thing was shot and ran off, the other 3 or 4 that were surrounding me were beginning to move in. Had I stood there any longer, or pursued the ridgeline, which is what I was originally heading for, I think they would have pounced on me and torn me limb from limb, judging by the appearance of what I saw. This thing looked clearly like a half-man, half-wolf hybrid that looked very comfortable walking on 2 legs, with large hands, or what appeared to be hands, and long black claws at the end of each fingertip, which, if I had to guess, would measure anywhere between 6 to 8 inches in length, and they were pretty thick. The hands resembled that of a raccoon hand. The chest had a large patch of fur on it, although these creatures, or the creature I saw, had long fur all over its body, and the head had a huge lion's-like mane, except it was more resembling of a wolf, and the eyes and the face were very much animalistic, except around the eyes and the brow ridge, which were more humanoid. But the few things that really stand out to me as truly disturbing, besides its facial expressions and its sheer intelligence and power and speed, were its teeth and its eyes, as soon as it opened its mouth and charged towards me. This thing had an unnatural amount of teeth, unlike any predator should have. I want you to think for a second. Imagine a shark, how a shark's mouth is full of razor teeth. They're not large teeth per se, but there's a bunch of tiny ones that are razor sharp. That's kind of how this thing was. They weren't like literal shark teeth, but this thing's mouth was overloaded with them. Tiny little daggers that I could clearly see from the distance that I was. I can't even imagine how they would look up close. I did not want to see that. It looked to be way too many teeth for its mouth. And its eyes. Its eyes appeared to be a very soft orange. They did not glow or give off any light, but they had such a fierceness to them that was almost striking just from looking at them. I have a cousin who's a very, very good illustrator, and I've thought many times about sitting down with him and having him illustrate what I saw that day. I'm sure he could bring it to life, just going by my descriptions, since the image of this thing will forever be burned in my mind. Feel free to ask me any questions. I'm happy to answer any of them. Thank you. I'm pretty fed up with my dogman situation. These two dogmen keep trying to break down my fence on the farthest side of my property, right against the thick woods. I can see these exact same two every evening at the same time, right around sundown, trying to completely dismantle it. I've shot at both of them before, but it's like they don't seem to care. I know I've struck both of them before, but they appear not to even be fazed by bullets. I've shot them with the .22 and .30-06, and bullets either don't hurt them, or they don't seem to be bothered by them. It's like some sort of freaky supernatural ability. The two I'm dealing with, there's a larger one, which I believe to be the alpha male. He's big, hulky and black, with gray on his front and part of his muzzle. And then there's a smaller one with him that has a much more slender frame. I almost wonder if that's his female mate, but I'm not too sure. They've already claimed 2 of my mares, and I refuse to let them claim any more. I only have 5 horses left, but they appear to be getting more and more aggressive as the day goes on. What doesn't make sense to me is they can get over my fence without having to dismantle it, which is why I'm not convinced why they have to dismantle my fence. That tells me they're trying to do that so more of them can come in. The fence I've had custom built to around 8 feet tall all around, for that exact reason, to keep these things out. And I know 8 feet tall wire fencing sounds unreasonable, but tell me, when you're dealing with 7 to 8 feet tall, upright canines, well, you tell me what you would do. I think they're trying to tear the fence down, so their smaller ones, assuming that is an alpha and a mate, can let their small pups through, and feed on the rest of my horses. Although I haven't seen them, so maybe they're back at home with mom and dad at the nest. I don't know. My worry is that they're going to work their way up to my house and start causing more and more trouble, possibly eliminating me, the only threat that stands between them and their pile of food, aka my horses. I got all the firepower ready if that's what they want to do. My worry is just that bullets won't stop them. When I was about 7 years of age, my real mom died of cancer, and I was adopted out by my aunt and uncle, who at the time were taking me in their lovely little home in the state of Arkansas. Luckily for me, I guess if you call me lucky in that circumstance, I wasn't really close with my mom, since I had had her in and out of custody due to her overwhelming fight with drugs and alcohol abuse. My father was a deadbeat, out of the picture, so I never knew him, and to this day, don't know who he is at all. Growing up, my aunt and uncle had amazing pastures in the back of their house, filled with sporadic trees here and there, and lots of woodland all around. Sometimes you would see all sorts of critters hopping about, which is pretty cool being a kid. As I got a little older, around 10, 11, and 12, I began to get pretty obsessed with the woods, even going back as far as I could, progressively more and more deeper into the woods, camping at night, for the thrill, and just to say I could do it. Many of my friends, and even my aunt and uncle, thought of me as very brave for the ordeal. I even tried to study on books that I could get from the library, like what supplies you need, camping gear, and what-ifs equipment, like how to start fire, emergency situation equipment, that kind of thing. Things a 10-year-old should be studying. Well, during the summer, one night, I was either 10 or 11 years old, and I had a dogman, at least what I believed to be a dogman, shove its entire head in my tent, look me dead in the face about 2 feet away for roughly 10 seconds, pull its head out, and casually walk away like nothing ever happened. I was so terrified, I wet myself and my entire sleeping bag, thinking I could have just been assaulted and torn apart by a werewolf, because at that age, I thought I really did see a real-life living werewolf. But now that I know as an adult that that was actually a dogman, not somebody who changed into that thing at a full moon. That's just silly. This particular time, I'd camped out pretty far, maybe about 500 or 600 yards away from my aunt and uncle's house. Like I said, their back pastures were pretty large, so I really tried to make it a thing to go far back as much as I could. I was also near a little creek, as the sound of the water stream helped me and lulled me into a sleep. I would sit up in my sleeping bag with my flashlight, reading comic books, and eventually I passed out, with my light still on. I was awakened sometime in the middle of the night, probably not too long after I fell asleep. I don't recall being woken from a super deep sleep, which means I probably didn't have too long to sleep and fall into a REM cycle. Something was coming near my tent, and it sounded large. I began to get scared, because my thoughts were it being a bear. And bears, in case you didn't know, can do some pretty gnarly damage to a human being. But it didn't sound like a bear. It was lighter on foot, if that makes any sense. And I think, looking back on it now, and not being able to discern this properly as a kid, but as an adult I think I can, it sounded, and I'm pretty sure about this, like it was on 2 feet, and not 4 like a bear. I know bears can walk on 2 feet for a very short distance, but they don't just casually walk around on 2 feet, at least not to inspect things the way this did. It circled my tent once or twice. I also realized my flap was completely open. Why I had not zipped it, I don't know. Ask my 10-year-old self that. Maybe I had felt too comfortable. Maybe I just forgot before I fell asleep. But either way, I had forgotten, and I didn't realize that until this thing stuck its head in. So after it circled my tent, about twice, very slowly, sniffing and shuffling, it gives me no warning and just shoves its entire mammoth-sized wolf head into my tent, and I'm about 2 feet away from this demonic-looking wolf that just stares at me with a blank expression on its face. Then, after about 10 seconds of being perfectly still, it pulls its head out like nothing ever happened and just walks away casually. Like I had said, I urinated all over myself and my tent and my sleeping bag. I waited about 5 minutes to make sure this thing was gone, grabbed my lantern, and I ran as fast as I could back to my aunt and uncle's house, banging on the door. They opened it. Well, my uncle did, wondering why I was so scared and why I had peed myself. I explained to him what I saw, and he just thought it was either tricks of the light, or maybe an animal, like a bobcat or something much smaller, had stuck its head in. But I explained to him over and over that's not what happened, and I know what most of those animals look like. This was undoubtedly a very, very large animal. When I said the words mammoth head, I mean it. I've seen lions at the zoo and big cats, and I kid you not, the head of this thing was enormous. It took all of its energy to shove its entire head in the face of my tent, looking right at me. The face was kind of like that of a wolf, but much more grim and ugly. It appeared to have patches of flesh missing from its face, not revealing dead tissue or bone underneath, but more almost kind of like it had a rash or skin condition, or mange. And it had a very fluffy part around its head and neck, kind of like a lion does. I think they call that a mane, but it was very thick and very, not fluffy, but very furry. This thing was pitch black, and had amber orangish reddish eyes, I guess. Its snout was more shorter, but it had a very wide face, and very, very strong eyes. Trust me when I say this, when you're face to face, nearly 2 feet away from this thing, you get the chance to have a pretty good look at it. My lantern was on next to me, so there was ample lighting in the tent. There wasn't a detail that I didn't miss staring at this thing. It never opened its mouth. It never revealed to me any teeth or showed any sign of aggression, which I'm not sure why. Its expression remained mono and blank the entire time it stuck its head in. I don't know if it was curious or what, and unlike any other Dogman stories, I didn't hear any howling, any growling, or any signs that it wanted to hurt me. I also didn't feel any ominous presences, like it was intended to come and get me. But I'll never forget how ugly and evil that thing looked. If you Google some pictures of werewolves, you can kind of get a general idea of what I mean by evil and fierce looking. A lot of werewolves have that same kind of look. They don't just look like a wolf. They almost have a sinister expression to their face, without actually having an expression. It's like their face just has a resting evil look. That's kind of how this thing was. And when it pulled its head out, I could tell that it was tall. Easily probably over 7 or 8 feet tall. And I'm going to say this again. I know for a fact it was not a bear or a mountain lion or a wolf. Neither of those animals would have behaved in this manner, nor would they have done this and just casually walked off on 2 legs, like I distinctively heard. With all the stories I hear about Dogman, I guess I'm really surprised that it didn't take the opportunity and kill me and eat me right then and there. It easily could have. I was pretty much prey on a silver platter, waiting to be torn apart. And why it never showed any aggression towards me once it stuck its head in. It just stared at me, and I don't know why. Was it trying to incite fear? What was it hoping to get done by doing that? And why did it just casually walk away? These are questions I've wondered for a long time. Because after that, I still kept camping out there. Call me crazy, but I did. Even though after that happened, I probably didn't go out there the rest of the summer. But the continuing summers, I did. And I think even that following fall I did. I never saw it again, and I never heard anything that big approach my tent or me at all during the nighttime ever again. So, the million-dollar question comes down to, what was its purpose? My wife's grandfather is from France and is full-blooded French. He grew up a long time ago, back in the early 1900s, in a very small village where they were plagued with the rougarou. Fortunately, I had the chance to talk to him before he passed a few years ago and ask him all about the rougarou that he personally encountered when he was younger. He was about 90-something when he passed about 4 or 5 years ago and had a plethora of personal encounters with this same creature back when he was just a boy, somewhere between 10 and 13 years old. His brother, who was 17 at the time of his own personal encounter, was killed by this very creature. What's interesting is my wife's grandfather thought the notion of the Western culture werewolf, the transforming into a werewolf under a full moon, that was complete nonsense, and that these creatures were supposedly from hell, and that people didn't actually transform. They were just wild demonic beasts that would feast and ravage the flesh of the innocent that it could get its hands on around the village. He also claimed that many of the men attempting to protect the village had lost their lives to this beast, this monstrosity, leaving the village extremely vulnerable. Many women and children began disappearing. You gotta remember, this is like back in the 20s or 30s, in very rural France. They didn't exactly have the cavalry to call in. They were pretty much on their own. And he never told me the name of the village, but my wife had showed me at one point, and I think it's somewhere south or east of Paris, but don't quote me on that. I can't remember exactly. I'll have to have her show me again. She remembers. But something else that he told me that I found very interesting is that this thing only came around certain times. And no, it wasn't on a full moon. It was like a seasonal thing, or certain times of the year it would appear, and only at night. Sometimes snatching defenseless women walking home, or even children who strayed too far away from the protection of men with rifles or their parents, or even small animals. It was even common to find the bones of those victims that it had claimed in the woods just beyond the safety of the tiny village. And get this, here's the kicker, and they were able to trap it and kill it, Hollywood style. Somehow, a group of the men there who were guarding the village were able to trick it and lure it into an older barn, where they trapped it, set the barn ablaze, and killed it, apparently. After that, they had rid themselves of their rougarou problem, and I guess that was the end of that, having casualties in the double digits, ranging from small animals to livestock to women and children and even men. While many of our modern-day Western culture doesn't take it seriously in the least bit, it's interesting to know and hear from a first-hand account that these things are real, and that he has seen it several times himself. When he went on to describe it for me, he described it as being very tall, easily 9 to 10 feet. Bear with me here because he actually used the term meters because he's European, so I've tried to get a rough estimate of what he meant in feet. It resembled that of a very, very large gray wolf, except just standing upright, having large claws and hands like a person, with opposable thumbs. He said the head and the snout were larger than they should have been, and the eyes were a fierce, glowing yellow. And the scariest part was this thing had the ability to telepathically speak to people. At least it spoke to him a couple of times, telling him that it was going to come after his family, kill him, and rip his throat out. Enough to terrify my wife's grandfather. In fact, many of the kids of the village would never play outside after the sun went down. This included every season, just out of fear. I guess this went on for about 5 or 6 years before this Rougarou was eventually caught and killed in that barn fire. The real mystery comes as to where it came from, who the Rougarou was, because at the time there was speculation it was somebody who kept transforming, but they quickly discarded that notion. As for myself, I've been a huge fan of creatures and cryptids like Bigfoot and all the likes for years and years, and so I can't exactly remember how I got on the conversation with him, but I started talking to him about werewolves and Bigfoot, and even though he didn't acknowledge Bigfoot, he started talking to me about the Rougarou, and that he never mentions it because nobody really believes him. Even my wife doesn't take him too seriously, but I found his entire sets of accounts very, very fascinating. If you ever have any personal run-ins with the Rougarou, stay away. They are extremely violent and very hostile, and they will kill on sight. And before I conclude my email to you, no, silver bullets don't work. That's a Hollywood thing. As far as what he told me, the only way to truly kill a Rougarou is setting it on fire and killing it that way. Thank you for taking the time to read this. I live in a pretty small rural town in northern Colorado. Not much happens around here. Even more so because, well, I don't really have neighbors, and it's pretty quiet. A great place for me and my wife, and to have a small section of goats. Until recently, something has came and claimed most of my goats, tearing them to shreds, not leaving much of anything. In fact, they are so torn up, there's hardly even any meat left on them. I have no idea what kind of predator does this, but certainly not a mountain lion, nor a wolf or a coyote. They will usually always eat and feast on the cadaver. So, what could possibly be tearing my goats into pieces? It all started when I woke up one early morning, about 5 a.m., made my cup of coffee, and went out to go feed my goats. Well, all of them, every single one of them, was dead, strewn about in their pen, guts and blood, literally everywhere, coating the walls and all over the ground. The smell was even worse than the sight, and I completely vomited all over myself and the ground. After going back inside, telling my wife, and calling the police, although looking back, there's not a whole lot they could do, but I figure I would cover every measure that I could. I tried to figure out what would do this, and I wondered if it might be a bear, but I don't know if there's any bears up here, at least in this area. And again, what predator kills all these goats and doesn't bother to either A, drag back the cadaver to eat on, or even bother to eat on the cadaver in the first place? You could tell that none of these animals had even been eaten on. There were no teeth marks. It's like all of them were just thrown into a blender or a shredder and then strewn about everywhere. Something had just killed these goats for the sake of killing, but I'm not exactly sure what or why. Part of me thinks this was done by a person to maybe enact revenge, although for what, I'm not sure. I haven't done anything to anybody out here, and I've only kept to myself. I haven't even made any friends, let alone enemies. but that's the only thing I could think of, is that maybe somebody snuck onto my property during the nighttime and slaughtered each and every goat. But then again, what kind of person would rip apart goats and then just leave their guts all about, without leaving any sort of tracks or evidence of the tools they used? It just doesn't make any sense. The killings and the way everything was strewn about makes me think of some kind of animal. I just can't exactly pinpoint what kind of animal it would be. That's why ultimately I'm messaging you. You seem to be an expert in the subject, so I'm hoping you can help me with my dilemma. A few years ago, I used to live in Illinois for quite some time. About 7 years, roughly, pursuing a dead-end career that I'm glad I got out of. I lived in a heavy agricultural area, so not an urban environment like many people would like to believe Illinois is. The area in which I lived in had lots and lots of corn, and if you've ever lived in or been in the Midwest, you would know that corn and grain is a huge market out here. But that's besides my point. I remember I heard stories about large upright wolf creatures living in the cornfields. That's when I first moved in, and I thought it was a joke, until I began hearing more and more about it. Well, there was a large cornfield not far away from where I lived, and several times, driving back at night, I could have swore that I saw the silhouette and shapes myself of a large upright walking canine going through the corn. One time, even staring at my vehicle as my headlights hit it, its red eyes glowing as it passed. As you can imagine, this scared me beyond my wits, but I maintained composure and didn't lose grip of the wheel or crash the vehicle. This thing just quickly ran by my car across the road, from one cornfield to another. Then, another night, about 4 nights after this one, I think, I saw it again, just emerging out of the cornfield. And that's when I got a much better look at this thing that supposedly was a werewolf that everybody was talking about. While I don't believe in the idea of werewolves, this thing resembled just that. In fact, it looked like it stepped right outside of a Hollywood movie set. Taller than my vehicle, which I drive a truck, so this thing was easily 9 feet tall. Bulkier than a linebacker on a football team, and a massive, massive head. In fact, if you've ever seen the movie Dog Soldiers, this thing resembled one of the creatures from that movie. Not entirely, but somewhat close. More so the head, how it is just so incredibly bulky and large, and very evil looking. This thing emerged from the corn just as I was driving by, like it was waiting for me to pass by so it could watch my vehicle go by. As soon as I passed it, I was kind of in shock to see it again for the second time in just a few short days. I looked back in my rearview mirror, and it didn't appear to be anywhere. So I don't know if it disappeared, darted across the road like a few nights prior, or just went back into the corn. I'm not exactly sure. But those are the only 2 times that I ever saw this creature. Afterwards, I would still be in Illinois for about another few years, but I had never seen this creature again. Even though I was living in that area, I had continuously heard stories about them stalking people, killing prey and animals, and even potentially hurting people, but never anything more than that. After a while, I kind of just stopped paying attention to the stories altogether and minded my own business. One of the reasons I'm happy to be out of that state.